In this video, we will build a special car paint material. For this, we will first create a realistic lighting setup, then generate procedural flakes with randomized colors that look much more realistic compared to standard car paint materials. So in this video, we're going to be building this nice procedural car paint shader that you can see in here. And you can see it behaves and looks quite realistic from any kind of angle. And as said, it's fully done in a procedural way. So it allows for a lot of customizations and you don't really require any kind of texture maps to make this work. And you can just set it up on the fly. So here on the left-hand side, you can see the final shader that we're going to be building in this video. You can see we have access on all of the important settings that we need in order to customize our shader. So our shader here is condensed in this node group. Let me just open the node group. You can see this is how the shader looks like. It's actually not very complicated, but everything is done in a procedural way. And I think this is all the settings and all of the adjustments you would need in order to make a realistic looking car paint shader. Let me go out of the node group again, and we'll be able to tweak in some of those settings in here. What I especially tried to emphasize was this kind of flaky appearance with these random colored flakes. And that's something that you oftentimes see in metallic car paint shaders. It actually has these kind of like randomized colors in those flakes. And you can see if I disable the flake coloring here, for example, you have this flaky appearance and it looks kind of boring and not very interesting. So if I increase here this coloring value, you can see we have these random colors which are mixed inside here. And this can make your car paint shaders look much more nice and interesting. Of course, we have lots of other settings here that we're going to be tweaking and dealing with, but let's discover this in the setup process of this shader. So before we can start working on the shading itself, it first makes sense to build a nicer looking lighting and environment setup. And as you can see at the moment, this here is not the case at all. It looks very flat and boring, and all the work that you would invest in the shader is kind of wasted and it will be very difficult to kind of read and understand what's actually happening. So before you start, you first need to take care of the lighting of the scene. In this case here, the very best way to do that is to build what we call an HDRI dome setup. And I built a own dedicated plugin for that will help me with the whole process. And this I will quickly show you now. So we just start by just dragging in an HDRI here into our environment. You can see at the moment here, this car is just floating somewhere in space. But as soon as I open my plugin, which is called Polydome, and enable Polydome, you can see that we have this whole nice dome setup here prepared where the car is now placed here on this ground plane. And we can now play around and just move our HDRI around. Let's actually use the one that I showed you already earlier in the demo scene. Let's just load this one inside here. Now we just need to go in and rotate this here in place. And I think like this, it looks fine. And at the moment, the resolution is very, very low. So let's just increase that. Let's use an 8K resolution, for example. And now we don't really need our asset browser anymore. You can see there's a small color shift here between the floor and the rest of the dome. So we can calibrate our floor. And once this is done, you can see that now the floor matches perfectly with the rest of the dome. We can now play here a little bit with the projection height and projection stretch to just get something that looks a bit more nicely fitting here for the scene. And we can also fine tune here our rotation again. So at the moment, our car looks already much nicer here, quite nicely integrated in the scene. If we want to, we can now play a little bit with the exposure, gamma. We can play a little bit with the warmth, and we can even add some vignette effect in here to get some final result. And if we want to, we can even add here some procedural water puddles on the floor to have some nice reflections of our car. So you can see how easy this was here to just build quickly an environment. And if you're interested about the plugin, you can find a link in the description of this video. Alternatively, there's of course also the way to build that up manually, and I did my own entire video about how to build a dome setup that you can find in my channel if you want to try to build this manually. Also the scene file here, as usual with all of my tutorial videos, you can find on my Patreon, and you can download it there if you want to follow along with it. But now without any further ado, let's see how we can make some nice and realistic looking car paint shader. For the final scene, I also went in and added these kind of procedural dirt effects that you can see here in various places. That's always a good habit in order to make your shaders look more realistic, more believable. But we're not going to be touching on this in this video. So if you want to know how this is achieved, subscribe to this channel and just watch that in a future video on my channel in here. So instead of working on a very complex model, I oftentimes like to work on these simplified shading dummies in here. You can see this has a combination out of curved and flat surface, and also has some creases and crevices for adding, for example, some procedural dirt effects and so on. And yeah, let's use this model here in order to set up our shader. So right now we're still using our finished node group. Let's just delete this. And let's just build a new Principal BSDF to start entirely from scratch, connect that to our material output, and we can just reduce here the base color a little bit to not have it completely white. And that's here our starting point right now. So for a car paint shader, the Principal BSDF is already a perfect starting point because it allows us easily to implement two different layers. We have our base layer to just define our overall color of the car. And then we have this code layer, which you can enable in here. And this one will serve as our transparent clear coat, which we will layer on top of everything. So as said, the Principal BSDF has all of this already implemented. And that's why we're going to be using this, of course, as our starting point. So at the moment, the roughness is set to 0.5. We can increase or decrease this here, of course. And in my case, let's just put here a roughness of 0.35 as a starting point. And you can see that at the moment, we didn't really set up any metalness for our shader. This also can be the case for many car paints. It doesn't have to be metallic as a base coat. But in our case, let's make a metallic shader. And for this, we have to increase here our metallic parameter. Let's for now increase this all the way to 1 to have this kind of like tinted reflections on our base layer. And now let's deal with our overall color first. At the moment, we just have this single color that defines the color for our entire shading dummy. But I want to make this look a little bit more nice and customizable by implementing a kind of fall off. So we will have different color tone for the areas which are more directed towards the camera. And then another color tone for the areas which are curved away from the camera. So in order to achieve that, let's just put here a mix color node. Let's just connect that into the base color. And then we can choose two different color values. Let's use this red one in here. And then just for temporary, this kind of bluish color tone for the other slot. And at the moment, everything is mixed here 50% together. So we get this kind of purple appearance, but that's what we're going to be changing now. So in order to separate the areas which are facing to the camera and away from the camera, we're going to be using the layer weight node. And let's just connect here the facing angle into the factor. And you can see we have kind of this effect already. So let me just navigate around here. You can see that everything that's geared towards the camera will be this reddish color, and everything that's facing away from it will be this kind of bluish color. That's exactly what we want in here. We can now use a Fresnel node and just connect that here into the blend input of the layer weight. And then with this IOR value, we can then define how far this is reaching in. So with the 1.5 default value, it will just be happening here a little bit on the sides. But once you increase this to higher values like 50, you can see we have now overall the blue taking over much more compared to these red areas, which are just focused around the center. Let's choose something like 10 here, maybe as a nice intermediate. You can see we have this nice blend between those two different colors. And we're able to customize the range here using this Fresnel node. So again, once I increase this here, you can see the blue is slowly taking over more. And once I decrease here, you can see that the red will eat more of our shader here, so to speak. So here I just went in and defined these two different color values. You can see we have more greenish towards the front and then more bluish and darker towards the side. Let's use this for our base paint for now. So now since we have our base color set up, I put everything in this frame so we can move this around together. And now we can deal with the most important part, and that's going to be the flakes for our base layer. So for this, we're going to be using a Voronoi texture. Let's just add this inside our node graph. And then let's press Ctrl T if you have the Node Wrangler plugin enabled to quickly add these mapping coordinates. So what we want to use is not the UVs, but the object's coordinates so that we don't rely on UVs. And let's now connect the color into the material output. You can see at the moment it doesn't really look like much. Let's just decrease the scale, for example, to 500. You can see we have now these kind of colorful flakes which appear here on our model. At the moment they look very generic, so let's just go in and tweak those settings here a little bit. So in order to make this look more complex, let's enable the normalized checkbox. And then with the detail slider, you can see we can add more layers here to this. Let's put a value of 1 for now to just kind of break up these shapes here a bit. The roughness we can increase to 0.75. And this value, let's put this at 3 for now. And I think like this, we can use it as a starting point for our flakes. So now I went inside and put everything into a frame again. And we're going to be using now the output of these flakes in order to drive 3 different things. We want to be mixing that into our base color. We want to be mixing that into our roughness. And we also want to be mixing that into our normal map. So let's first start with the roughness. And for this, let's put a map range node in here and then connect the color output to the value and then connect the result into the roughness. You can see it's breaking up the roughness here now on our shading dummy. We don't really want to have it like this. This doesn't really look very nice. So we have to play with these values in here. Let's put the toMin value to 0.5 and the toMax value to 0.1. And I think like this, we have a nice breakup here in this specular highlight. You can see we don't really have this like very uniform splotch anymore, but we're kind of breaking this up here nicely with this Voronoi texture. And I think like this, it already looks quite nice. Let's go back into our camera view. And now we can use the same Voronoi texture in order to drive the normal map here of our shader. So for this, let's temporarily unplug the roughness. Let's add a normal map node inside here. Let's connect the color into the color of the normal map and then connect the normal into the normal of our shader. You can see at the moment our effect here is of course way too strong. So let's dial the strength back. Let's use maybe 0.1 or maybe 0.075 and let's use the object space here instead, because otherwise we might get some issues because this one is not a properly generated tangent space normal map. So this one here is a bit more robust and normally doesn't really create any kind of shading issues. So now we can also connect the roughness back again and we can see both of those effects here combined now. So now we have some nice flakes already going on, but we don't really have these randomized colors yet. So for this, let's add a new mix color node. Let's place that inside here. And what we want to do now is to use this one here in the divide mode. And then let's also mix the color in the slot B in here. You can see once we do this, we can play here with the factor. And if we have this all the way at 0, it's not mixing in any color. But if we have this all the way at 1, you can see we have these kind of like randomized colors which are appearing now in here. And I think this makes it look already more interesting. Let's reduce this maybe to 0.75. And now, of course, also the scale here is way too big. I just left it at the larger scale so we can see what we're doing. But now we can go inside and then just bump up here the scale for our Voronoi texture. Let's use 2500, for example, or maybe something like 5000. So now we can even lower here this factor to 0.5 to have this a bit more subtle. And I think like this, I think we have quite a nice base coat, as you can see here, where we have this flaky appearance. We have these randomized flakes in here. We have these nice highlights. And I think this is now quite a nice base coat, which we can now use in order to build our clear coat on top of that. So now, since we have our nice base layer here finished, we can introduce the clear coat, which is layered on top of that. And for this, in the Principal BSDF, let's open the code tab. Let's increase the weight here all the way to 1. You can see that now we have this clear coat, which is layered on top of our base shader. And this makes it already look quite nice and almost like a finished 𝐘𝐨𝐿 shader. But of course, let's try to improve this here a little bit by just adding some distortions in the clear coat, because at the moment this is like a perfect clear coat. There's no bumps or no imperfections in that. So in order to see those, let's increase here the IOR to 100 temporarily so we can see our clear coat here quite nicely. And let's decrease the roughness to 0. And now let's add some bump map in order to break up here the perfection of the surface a little bit and add some kind of variations in here. For this, let's add a new noise node in here. Let's put this at this position. And then we also need to put a bump map node inside here. And then we're just gonna connect the color with the height and then just put the normal into the normal of the code slot. Once we do this, you can see there's quite a drastic effect, of course. Let's go in and first press Ctrl T to add our mapping coordinates. We want to be using also the object's coordinates here again. And now we can play with the scale. Let's increase that, for example, to 25. For detail, let's use 10. The roughness, I think we can leave for now, and all of the other settings as well. So now we just have to dial in our strengths. For example, let's use 0.1. You can see this is still very strong, 0.01. And I think this is slowly starting to get somewhere. You can see we have this kind of like crisp reflections, but they are broken up here. We have this kind of like orange peel effect here going on. We can now lower the IOR again to 1.5. And you can see we have this kind of nice, a little bit broken up Clearcoat here on top, and this makes it overall look more realistic than it did before. So as the last step, I went in and put all of those in a frame again to make it look nicer, more tidied up, and this would be basically our finished car paint shader. So now as a last step, I went in and created here this custom node group, and I basically just piped all the relevant aspects here of this shader into the different inputs of this node group in here. And like this, we can then define our shader in a much easier way. So I'm just going to show you what I did here exactly. So I have these two different color values where I can basically define the overall color here of this car. And with the color intensity, I can just define how the Fresnel falloff here works, so how strong that is basically. And with the metallicness, I can define how metallic here this car paint is. And you can see like this, it would be a non-metallic car paint. And normally I like to have this here all the way at 1 because as you can see, this looks more nice. We also have adjustments for our base roughness. So we can change the roughness here of our car paint. We can change the IOR of our car paint. So if it's not a metallic car paint, we can define that in here. And we have the amount of flakes. So you can see I can dial in the amount of flakes. Like this, there's no flakes. Like this, we have a lot of flakes. We can also play with the scaling. So I can make those bigger. I can make them much smaller if I want to. And we also have here adjustments for the coloring. So if I disable this, you can see we don't really have this colored effect. Like this, the car paint definitely looks more boring. But if we enable here a stronger coloring, you can see this looks much, much nicer. Lastly, we have here our flake bump also. We can define the bumpiness here of the car paint. Let's just put that back to the original value. And then also we have, of course, controls for our Clearcoat amount. So I can disable the Clearcoat. You can see there's no reflections here anymore. I can enable this. I can play with the IOR and I can play with the scaling of these bumps in here. It's maybe a little bit difficult to see, but if I bump up the IOR, I can make here the bumps in the Clearcoat stronger or less strong. And I can also play with the overall bumpiness of the Clearcoat. So all of those adjustments here are now in this node group. That's quite a nice way to have all of them handy because you normally would only need to play around with those ones. And all of the other adjustments that we have here in the shader are kind of hidden. And this makes it quite easy to use. As usual, you can find all of the scene files together with this node group, of course, on my Patreon if you want to use that one, or you can just rebuild it following this tutorial. So I hope this was overall useful for you. I hope to see you next time in the next tutorial. Until then, take care and see you soon.